Camp Duboce was a World War II POW camp located near Duboce, Wyoming, in a very isolated location on the Shoshone National Forest. Camp Duboce had about 140 prisoners. The camp was established at the request of the Wyoming Tie-in Timber Company to provide critically needed labor to cut timber. The timber that was harvested was primarily used to make railroad ties, which were a very important war commodity. There were 19 prisoner of war camps in Wyoming. Most of the camps were agricultural camps. However, Camp Duboce was one of the 4 camps that served the timber industry. Camp Duboce operated from July of 1944 through January of 1946. They operated seasonally and closed during the winter months when the snow got too high, and remained closed until they could access the site again in the spring. The prisoners lived in wood-framed tents, and there were usually 4 prisoners assigned to each tent.
So we're standing on the Camp Duboce main access road, and we just passed Main Street. And we're looking now into the POW tent enclosed area. So this is where the POW tents were, and they were surrounded by wire fencing. So this is the POW camp root cellar, where they stored a lot of their perishables. They usually only got supplies like once a week, so it was very important to keep their perishables covered and cool. You can see now it's been caved in. When they left the site, it was bulldozed over. And they used the root cellar quite a bit. And then in 1945, they actually installed an electric refrigerator next to the POW camp mess hall to reduce meat spoilage. And then the root cellar was still used, but they used the refrigerator more for meat.
The POW camp site included wood-planked buildings such as the prisoners' mess hall and the enlisted men's mess hall, and the latrines and the wash buildings and storage sheds. There was a main street that separated the POW tent area from the other buildings. You can still see the remains of the buildings and also the wooden flumes and walkways that the prisoners used at the camp.
This was a unique piece of history, and it's still there. These guys were engineers. They had a little sawmill. It was big enough that they could cut the lumber out of to build the tent platforms. They were able to build their water source. That water source picked up the water, and they carried the water down to the development in the camp, and then they divided it to one side, to the left side, which was where the military was housed, and then the right side went down through the tent camp. These guys were able to construct that with a little more than that little sawmill.
The wooden walkways were built in between the rows of the prisoners' tents that led between the tent aisles to the latrine, which were very important because they got a lot of use, and the ground was very wet, especially during the winter and spring months. I'm standing next to the POW latrine, and you can see the foundation and the latrine pit hole here.
A small stream ran through the property and provided drinking water and wash water, and electricity was provided by 2 light plants that were run by generators and turned off each night at 10 p.m. Lieutenant Harlemer, the Duboce camp commander, kept detailed records and documentation about the camp. The POW work assignments were primarily cutting down trees with 2-man cross-cut saws in the forest. The prisoners dragged the logs from the logging sites to the sawmills with teams of horses. POWs worked at the sawmill, cutting, stacking, and loading the ties on the trucks, which hauled the ties from the mountain down to the Wind River, where they were stacked for the annual tie drive. The following spring, the ties were floated down the river about 85 miles to the creosoting plant in Riverton.
It took probably about 11 people to operate a sawmill. If there were 150 people in the POW camp, there had to be something like 10 sawmills out there in the woods. And they were scattered over this north-facing slope. Prisoner of war camp came along in the Tyak era, more at the tail end. They didn't have to hand hew the ties. In most cases, they worked around a sawmill and hauled the ties to a loading area, in most cases along the side of the stream someplace.
In 1945, a group of 50 prisoners of war were sent from Camp Scottsbluff, Nebraska, specifically to assist on the tie drive, along with 5 Native Americans and 10 Swedes. According to the newspaper report, the tie drive to Riverton was expected to take about 20 days. In addition to cutting timber, other POWs worked right at the Camp Duboce site, and they worked as camp cooks, filing saws, and cutting firewood that was needed to keep the tents warm. I conducted many interviews with families of former Camp Duboce enlisted men and prisoners of war, and they provided more personal details and information about the Camp Duboce experience. In 2017, I asked a Duboce High School exchange student from Germany to help translate a letter to German officials to try to locate former POWs. It took several months, but finally they found one surviving German prisoner of war that agreed to speak with us. We cut off the branches and cut the logs into specific lengths, then slid them down the mountain. We got up at 6 a.m., ate, and left the camp by 7 a.m. We worked in the forest all day cutting down trees. Since we worked with civilian workers, we had both Saturday and Sundays off to do chores and to rest. He described the tents that they slept in, and he said, "We slept with 2 blankets on folding beds. We washed in the creek." And he remembered that the water was clean but very cold. He related that they did not have much free time for other activities, and they were too tired anyway after working so hard. The former POW was fascinated with the cowboys who worked in the area, and he especially shared stories about a cowboy that worked in the timber camp with him. And even though the interview was in German, you could hear the excitement in his voice when he talked about the stories about the cowboys. Both Lieutenant Harlemer and a German prisoner of war shared their experience of being snowbound together at Camp Duboce during the Christmas of 1944 with over 3 feet of snow. Lieutenant Harlemer writes in a letter, "Last night, I attended a program put on by the German PWs in their mess hall. It was exceptionally good, and I really enjoyed it. The PWs had their mess hall all decorated with wreaths and greenery from the forest. They built a platform for the program and had a Christmas tree with candles and even a special lighting for the event. When we went into the mess hall, the tables were full of Christmas items, including nuts, candy, cookies, cookie houses made by the PW cooks, oranges and apples, and among all things, 4 bottles of beer for each PW. Beer had been pretty difficult to get up here due to it being rationed, so the little beer they were able to get before Christmas, they saved for the big event. They invited all the American personnel to the party, too, and had a special table prepared for us, which included beer and candy, which they paid for out of their own money. The essays and poems and information provided by the POWs and the information, reports, and photos shared by the military personnel all provide insight into what life was like in Camp Duboce and other World War II POW camps across Wyoming and in the United States.